Thanks for tuning in to video 8 in our video series. Is communication with God truly possible? The case of the law has often been presented to us Christians in the sort of fashion where the law was provided by God in order to convict us of guilt. This is actually a pretty strange argument if you really think about it. The argument assumes that there would not be any guilt if the law was not known. That is, if I lived during that time, I would have no idea. There would be no possible way for me to know that murdering someone was wrong unless the law was presented to me in an oral fashion that my ears could hear and my mind could understand. Before I had heard that God created a law against murdering people, I could kill people and I would not have guilt or feel any remorse. But after I heard the law, then I would have guilt. Before I had heard the law against coveting, I could see my neighbor's house and dream up ways I could take it from him without a tinge of guilt. But as soon as I realized God has a law against that, then immediately I received guilt when I covet. I doubt any of the Israelites, after receiving the Ten Commandments, thought to themselves, "Geez, where do these come from? Whoops, I'm not going to be able to do that one anymore." I don't think the Ten Commandments came as a surprise to any of them, and I doubt that any of them felt any more guilt now doing something wrong than they felt beforehand. It's just that now, as a result of the law, and many other laws that were to be instituted, there was now swift justice, usually in the form of rocks thrown at the head, to be meted out for anyone who was a lawbreaker. In that sense, I'll wager that breaking the law didn't bring guilt so much as it brought fear. Are we to believe that all nations that existed during that time other than Israel were in a state of complete anarchy? Did other nations have no laws to keep the order? Did they just act out every single impulse they had with no thought to how it affects other people? Were there no laws, whether written or gained through oral tradition, that kept order by having rules to promote good conduct and avoid bad conduct? The state of other nations tends to look like complete anarchy when I allow the Bible to dictate to me the true status of other peoples during the times of ancient Israel. We are unable to see the affection and kindness those within other nations display towards one another because the Bible doesn't reveal much of the interpersonal nature of other societies. We have to pretty much assume they are all bad because the Bible depicts most of the ancient Gentile nations as child-sacrificing, idol-worshipping abominations. Are we to assume, though, because a nation is depicted as such, that every individual within the nation is equally evil? Surely Israel itself often adopted pagan practices and began worshiping other gods and offering up sacrifices to idols. That doesn't make all of Israel evil. Surely there must have been some women within these foreign nations who actually loved their children and couldn't bear the thought of killing them by setting them on top of the hot burning lead arms of Moloch. Just as today many of us would assert there are good people in bad religions, why couldn't we take that obvious truth to the next logical step and assert that there are good people in bad nations? Why do we assume that because some women in pagan cultures sacrifice their children to Baal, all of them do? That is a ridiculous deduction. Yes, it is probably highly likely that if the women were in a culture where it was expected, even required for them, to give sacrifices to the gods, they would give some sort of sacrifice. Otherwise, they would risk alienation from their families, friends, possibly the culture at large. There is nothing inherently sinful about offering a sacrifice to a god. Indeed, the Jews' Jehovah required sacrifices on a daily basis. But perhaps the nature of the sacrifice might be the cause for sin. If you sacrifice an animal that you were going to kill anyway for food, there doesn't seem to be anything inherently wrong or evil in that. But if you sacrifice a human being, or if you sacrifice an animal just for the sake of killing it, but you have no intent on eating it or sharing its meat, I would find both of these things sinful. Of course, killing the human would be the much more grievous sin. I'm sure the Bible actually agrees with me on that one. However, as far as the sin of offering sacrifices to the wrong God, the intent is both the same: to please God or the gods and bring about their favor. The fact is, we don't know what all people sacrifice to their gods in pagan cultures. Perhaps some watched others with fear and anger as they sacrificed their children, thinking, if only those people could understand how much pain they are putting their children through. Perhaps they participated in rituals, sacrificed animals to the gods, but maintained a close and intimate relationship with their husband or wife and children. Perhaps they thought to themselves, where else can I go? Who would accept me if I left? Maybe they even considered going to the people of Israel, only to having heard stories that they have a very powerful God who fights for them, only to change their mind when they realized that Israel tended to be very hostile towards idol worshippers and had a long history of going into idol-worshipping towns and cities and wiping out not just the fighting men, but also the women and children, sometimes even the animals. Surely that is not a place where I will be accepted or protected, so I better just stay where I'm at, even though watching my friends and neighbors sacrifice their children is killing me. Who can prove that such people did not exist within corrupt cultures of that time? We cannot know based on written history that there were not kind and decent people among atrocious nations like the Canaanites, the Babylonians, and even the Assyrians. To assume that all people within a nation are alike in their evil is to take a huge brushstroke and paint all of humanity with it, blurring all distinctions among people. It's like saying that because China is a communist country, all of its people are godless and evil. Living in a country where evil practices take place does not mean that all participants of that country take part in evil practices. Perhaps we should consider that there may be more to the story than what the Bible is telling us. Maybe we should wonder in our minds what the little boys and girls of pagan cultures did to deserve death by the hands of Israelite warriors. So what was my point? Wow, I went off into a pretty big tangent there. All I was trying to say was that this man, in order to ensure his mind stays in a realm that is rational and sensible, should judge the past by the present. And today, when we look at evil countries and nations, we often find good people who are present within. People who must live within the horrible conditions that define their country. Therefore, when we use the present as our matrix for viewing the past, we come to a rightful conclusion that there were most likely some kind and gentle people who lived in Canaan, who lived amongst the Philistines. And in all likelihood, some of these kind and gentle people were probably slaughtered by Israel because they were assumed to be evil when instead they were only misled and had really no other alternatives. Now, in spite of the realizations this man, I, have made, I currently find myself teetering on the edge of Christianity, entertaining certain notions for a time, then putting them out of my mind, out of sight. I am not yet willing, or perhaps I am unable, to completely abandon this perspective that has so defined my life for such a long period of time. Yet, in spite of my inability to completely abandon, I can frequently make short pit stops away from it, visiting other paradigms. I always have to be on guard against immersion within a faith, any faith, simply because of my history. My obsessive nature makes it necessary for me to tread lightly across the ocean of worldviews. It seems that if I get stuck in one for too long, I begin sinking into it, and before long I'm thrashing about, trying to reach the surface and get some air. Perhaps I've reached the point where I really am not too emotionally involved in any particular one, giving me the ability to make better observations of the faiths at large. Being able to see the entire thing from a distance, rather than being submerged within it, and trying to discern the shape and contour of it from within its belly. Of course, you cannot truly objectively compare it with other faiths until you are able to see all the possible candidates from a distance. As long as you find yourself within a particular faith, comparing it to all the others will only be an exercise of subjective proportions, but without any real objective analysis. The reason for this is you are subject to all the hopes, dreams, desires, and yes, even threats that exist within your faith. And these things can have a huge emotional impact on you, which can impair your reason. Our reason, rather than being like some mathematical formula, dry and exacting, is much more intimately tied with our emotions than many of us would like to admit. Okay, I'll continue this in the next video.